Her daughter-in-law skipped her dessert, so she served her the deed. Marlene Sharp, 72, widow and former baker, smiled through the insult, then spent the night rewriting every document in her name. By sunrise, her son and his wife weren't homeowners anymore. They were tenants. She'd been dismissed as old and out of touch. Now she was the landlord, the trustee, and the woman they underestimated one too many times. Because age doesn't weaken control, it refines it. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Marlene stood at the edge of her backyard, watching the gathering unfold. The sun was high in the sky, casting warm golden light over the tables that Jason had set up for Emily's birthday brunch. The mismatched chairs, the pastel-colored napkins, the sparkling champagne glasses, everything looked perfect. Everything was in its place. And yet, it all felt a little hollow. She had baked her famous lemon bars that morning, the ones that had always been a staple at these family gatherings. The smell of fresh citrus and sugar had filled her kitchen as she carefully cut each square into neat little pieces. It was a routine, something familiar, something she could control in a world that seemed to be slowly slipping away from her. But as she stepped onto the patio carrying the tray of lemon bars, she saw it. The plates were already laid out on the long dining table, each one gleaming with a delicate slice of cake. Everyone had been served. Everyone except her. "You're right on time, Marlene," Emily said, her voice sweet but with an undercurrent of something else. She looked at the tray in Marlene's hands. "At your age, you probably shouldn't." The words were carefully chosen, wrapped in a sickly sweet tone that barely masked the disdain. Marlene froze. The tray felt heavy in her hands now. Too heavy. She glanced at the plate set before her. A clear absence. A deliberate oversight. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, but Jason, of course, said nothing. He simply picked at his food, his eyes avoiding hers. Marlene's hand tightened around the handle of the tray, the polished surface of the wood pressing into her palm, grounding her. The awkward silence hung in the air, but she wouldn't let it break her. Not today. Without a word, she placed the tray down on the edge of the table. She didn't need to explain herself to them. The guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, as the moment dragged on. They were all trying to pretend they hadn't noticed the snub, but Marlene could see it in their eyes. Some of them didn't know where to look. Some of them avoided her gaze altogether. "Thanks for the invite," she said, her voice smooth, but just sharp enough to cut through the tension. Then, without another glance at the table, she turned and walked away. Her steps were measured, deliberate, each one falling with purpose. She didn't rush, didn't let herself break into a sprint like she wanted to. The silence of the backyard was deafening as she crossed the lawn, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face remained calm, collected. As she reached the gate, she heard the soft murmur of voices behind her, Jason's deep, quiet voice trying to reason with Emily. He was probably telling her to stop. But it didn't matter. Marlene walked past the gate, didn't even look back. She could feel the weight of her years pressing against her, but she wasn't going to let them make her feel irrelevant. Not today. Inside her car, she didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there, letting the world outside continue without her. Her hand reached into her purse, fingers brushing the familiar corners of the deed to her house, a cold reminder of what she had. Then her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with Valerie's name. "You all right?" the text read. Marlene hesitated for a moment before typing back, her fingers steady on the screen. "I'll be fine." The words sent her heart racing, but it was not from fear. It was from a simmering fury that had been bubbling under the surface for years. Today, it was no longer a quiet anger. Today, it was a fire that was beginning to burn, and it would take everything in her to keep it contained. She didn't respond to Valerie's second text, the one asking if she was sure. Instead, Marlene turned the key in the ignition and drove off, the sound of her tires on the pavement becoming the only thing that mattered now. Marlene sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the morning's events still hanging over her. The house was too quiet, the silence oppressive after the chaos of Emily's birthday brunch. She'd been a part of this home for decades, but today, it felt as if she no longer belonged. She gripped the edge of the table, her fingers white with tension, as she stared at the small leather-bound folder resting in front of her. It was the deed to her house, her sanctuary. The house she'd built from the ground up with years of hard work, and every penny earned from the sweet scent of butter and sugar. It was the only thing that had ever felt truly hers, and she knew it as intimately as the lines on her hands. 100% hers. Yet, for the last few years, that sense of ownership had been slipping away. Jason and Emily had made themselves at home here in ways that cut deeper than she cared to admit. Their sense of entitlement was suffocating, like an insidious vine creeping across the landscape of her life. And the most cutting of all, they treated her like a guest in her own space, as if she were the one overstepping, she were the one intruding. Her breath caught in her throat as she thought of the money she had poured into Jason's home renovation 5 years ago. The money she'd never been repaid. She didn't regret it, not in the moment. Jason had needed it, and she had been happy to help. But now it felt like a debt she'd never be allowed to call in, a kindness turned weapon. She opened the folder, her eyes flicking over the original deed again, the inked signatures, the neat lines of the legal document. It had always been a simple thing, but now it was a reminder of everything she was about to lose, or rather, reclaim. They only respect what they think they control, Valerie had said just yesterday over tea, her voice dripping with the kind of wisdom that came from years of watching people chase shadows of power. Valerie was right. Marlene had given Jason and Emily a generous amount of freedom, too much. She had let them push and prod at her boundaries until they had become something amorphous, something that could be bent and shaped at their will. But today, that changed. She had let it go for too long. Today, Marlene was taking control. She stood up, pushing the chair back with a quiet, deliberate scrape. The folder was cold in her hand as she walked over to her desk, where she kept her most personal documents. A new folder was waiting. It was sleek, professional, and full of empty space, ready for the transformation she was about to make. With a steady hand, Marlene opened the folder and slid the deed to her house inside, alongside a stack of freshly printed papers. She took a deep breath, eyes narrowing as she thought of the conversation she had been avoiding for months. The conversation she'd finally come to terms with. It was time to make things official. She grabbed her phone from the counter, her thumb tapping quickly across the screen to Eli Carson's number. Eli was the only one she trusted in matters like this. He was practical, quiet. He understood the weight of family dynamics, even if he'd never say it aloud. The phone rang twice before Eli's deep voice answered. "Marlene, I need to revise some ownership paperwork," she said, her voice steady, controlled, though her insides were coiled tight like a spring. "Make sure Jason and Emily are removed from everything. I'm ready." There was a pause on the other end. Marlene could almost hear him assessing the weight of her words, but she wasn't about to back down now. Not after everything. "All right," Eli replied, his voice calm without a trace of surprise. "I'll have the paperwork ready by the end of the day. We'll get this taken care of." Marlene's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that, but there was no turning back now. She hung up, her fingers still lingering on the phone as though she might change her mind. But she didn't. She couldn't. She looked at the folder, now filled with legal documents. every one of them a silent promise to herself. She wasn't just taking control of her house, she was taking control of her life. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't realized she'd lost: power. Real, undeniable power. The back door creaked open, and Valerie's voice echoed in from the yard. "You sure about this?" Marlene didn't turn. She didn't need to. Valerie's understanding, her support, had always been a given. She was a quiet ally in the background, watching Marlene when everyone else had stopped paying attention. "More sure than I've ever been," Marlene said, her voice low but resolute. She walked to the window, looking out over the backyard, where Emily and Jason's little world was still humming along as if nothing had changed. But Marlene knew something they didn't. The shift was already happening, and it was only just beginning. The morning after, the weight of Marlene's decision still pressed on her chest. She sat at her kitchen table again, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, watching the steam spiral up before dissipating into the still air. The house felt larger somehow, more open, as if she had finally broken free of something that had been constricting her for years. Yet there was no peace in that freedom. Not yet. The ping of her phone shattered the quiet. Emily's name lit up the screen. Same time, same place. "Marlene, bring lemon bars?" Marlene's thumb hovered over the screen. She could almost hear Emily's voice, sweet as always, pretending nothing had changed. But Marlene knew. Emily knew too. Everything had shifted. She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze dropped to the counter, where her stack of new trust documents sat, neatly organized by Valerie just the day before. The trust, the deed, the lease agreement. Each piece of paper now a symbol of the control she was beginning to reclaim. A control that Emily and Jason could no longer ignore. She had always baked those lemon bars, always brought them to these family gatherings. But this time she wasn't going to play the part she had played for years. The quiet, obliging mother-in-law who showed up and smiled through the awkwardness. No more. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness as she typed out her response. "I'll be unavailable." There. It was done. Simple. Clear. The words felt more like a declaration than a message. Emily would read them as she pleased, likely with confusion, frustration, maybe even anger. But it was the truth. Marlene was unavailable. Before she could think twice, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Jason. "Why are you being difficult?" The words were accusatory, as though she owed him an explanation for her absence. But Marlene was done explaining herself. She wasn't going to be the one to bend anymore, to make peace at the cost of her own dignity. She let the phone buzz until the screen went dark. No reply. Let Jason stew in that frustration. With a sigh, she pushed the phone aside and picked up the stack of documents Valerie had prepared. They'd spent the previous afternoon filling out the trust paperwork, setting up the new lease agreement, ensuring that Jason and Emily were now formally tenants in her home, no longer the owners they'd always acted like. Valerie had insisted that Marlene needed to take the next step. "Put it in writing," she'd said. "Make it official." Marlene had agreed, but that didn't mean it was easy. Valerie had left early that morning, but Marlene knew her friend's support was unwavering. She could almost hear Valerie's voice now, a low murmur of reassurance in the back of her mind. They only respect what they think they control. She ran a hand through her hair, then reached for the lease agreement, the words still feeling foreign even as she signed them. Jason and Emily now had a lease, just like any other tenant. They would pay rent, and she would collect it. It was all so simple, yet so deliciously satisfying. The final document was a rent invoice. Eli Carson had prepared it, like a quiet reminder of how things would unfold from here on out. The amount was reasonable, the terms clear. It would be sent to Jason and Emily, marked with an official stamp. She picked up her phone again and sent a brief message to Eli. Send the invoice. Let them see the paper trail. They'll get the point. Eli responded almost instantly. A single word. Done. Marlene leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on the desk. The quiet, steady ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder now. Her fingers tapped the edges of the documents, as if testing their weight, testing how solid this new reality felt. It was strange how powerful something as simple as paperwork could be, yet it wasn't just the documents. It was the knowledge that, at long last, she had taken control. The thing she had feared losing the most had always been hers. A soft knock on the door startled her. She had been so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't heard Valerie returning. Marlene stood up and opened the door, her lips pulling into a small smile. Thought I'd stop by, make sure everything was as it should be, Valerie said, glancing at the pile of papers on the table. Marlene nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The two women shared a knowing look, but no words were needed. They both understood that the path ahead wasn't easy. It would get worse before it got better. But Marlene was no longer afraid of the mess. She wasn't backing down. Valerie's eyes moved over the documents on the table, then locked onto Marlene's. You're going to enjoy watching them squirm, Valerie said, her tone both amused and approving. Marlene smiled, a slow, calculated smile. Oh, I intend to. As they sat down, the phone buzzed again. Another text from Jason. Are you really going to do this? For a moment, Marlene stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the reply. What would she say? The answer was simple, but somehow it felt monumental. Finally, she typed back. I already have. And with that, she set the phone down, her resolve unshakable. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that promised the first chill of fall, but inside Marlene's house, it was warm, quiet, and filled with a growing sense of satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came with taking back control, bit by bit, piece by piece. Marlene stood by the front door, key in hand, as her fingers hovered over the keypad of the backyard gate. She could hear the faint sound of cars rumbling down the street, but nothing that could distract her from the task at hand. She punched in the new code, one she'd set just that morning, and watched the lock give a soft, mechanical click. The gate had always been a symbol of entry. Today, it was a barrier. A message, quiet but firm, to anyone who thought they could waltz in uninvited. Specifically, Emily. Her fingers lingered on the numbers for a moment before she stepped back, eyes narrowing. Emily wasn't going to show up here and take over. Not today. The boundaries had been redrawn. Marlene wasn't going to let the familiar rituals continue. Not while she was building something new. The phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Emily. Of course. Just getting here to prep. Let me in? Marlene didn't even flinch as she read the message. She wasn't surprised. Emily had always assumed things would go her way. Always walked in as if the space belonged to her. She stood there for a moment longer, the cold air biting at her face as she watched the sun dip lower in the sky, painting the yard in warm amber hues. Then she picked up the intercom. I said I'd be unavailable. Marlene's voice was calm, collected, but beneath it there was a quiet strength. She didn't need to explain herself any further. She wasn't going to repeat the same broken cycle of hospitality and indulgence. She pressed the button to end the call before Emily could respond, her thumb lingering for only a moment. It felt good. Almost like a victory. Marlene glanced out the window as the familiar rumble of Jason's truck rolled up the driveway. His tires kicked up a light dust from the gravel, and she knew from the tightness in his movements that he wasn't going to be happy about the situation. A few moments later, she heard the front door open. Jason's footsteps were quick, but the sound of them, sharp, impatient, told her everything she needed to know. When he found her, Standing in the kitchen with a calmness that only made him more tense, he let out a heavy sigh. "Marlene," he began, but his voice was already on edge. "You can't just not let her in. We've got a whole thing planned. She's here to help." Marlene didn't even look at him as she lifted her glass of iced tea to her lips, taking a slow sip. Valerie, who had been sitting beside her, raised an eyebrow and took a small drink of her own, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. "I told her I'd be unavailable," Marlene said simply, turning to face him. "That's all there is to it." Jason's jaw tightened. He was upset. His face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. "You're being difficult, Mom," he muttered, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than her. "I'm being respectful," Marlene replied, her tone measured. "There's a difference." Jason ran a hand through his hair, turning away as if he were searching for something to hold on to. He clearly wasn't ready to admit the truth. Not to her, not to himself. But the house, her house, had always been a space he took for granted, and now he could feel it slipping away. "Look, Jason," Marlene said, her voice still calm but her eyes hardening. "This isn't about me being difficult. This is about you and Emily trying to control everything around here, and I'm done letting you do that." Jason didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, as if trying to process the words, but the silence was telling. He didn't have an argument, not one that could stand up to the truth. She turned her attention back to the table, where the stack of documents from the day before sat neatly. The lease agreement, the updated trust, and now, the new papers that would officially transfer ownership into the trust. No more back and forth. No more pretending like Jason and Emily had a say. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up quickly, already knowing who it was. Eli Carson. A single message. "The next step is done. The transfer is in motion." Marlene's lips quirked into a small, quiet smile. She hadn't expected it to happen so quickly, but it did. The wheels of change were turning, and no one, not Emily, not Jason, could stop it now. "I'll be back tomorrow to get everything settled," Jason said, his voice flat as he turned toward the door. Marlene didn't reply. She simply watched him leave, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Valerie took a long, slow sip of her iced tea, a quiet but knowing look crossing her face. "This is just the beginning, huh?" Marlene nodded slowly, her eyes focused on the backyard, now bathed in twilight. The house was hers. The land was hers. And the control she had been quietly relinquishing for years, it was coming back, piece by piece. "It's just getting started," Marlene said, her voice soft, but with a quiet fire behind it. The county clerk's office was quieter than usual for a Thursday morning. A faint hum from the fluorescent lights hung overhead, mixing with the muted sound of printers and the occasional squeak of shoes against the tile floor. Marlene stood at the counter, a neatly organized folder clutched to her chest. Her hands didn't tremble. Not this time. She had dressed carefully for this. Dark slacks, her pressed cream blouse, and her pearl earrings. Not out of vanity, but because she knew that dignity was armor. And today, she was going into battle. Terry Carson, the records clerk, looked up from behind the glass window. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for catching every detail. She smiled when she saw who it was. "Well, morning, Ms. Sharp," Terry said, her voice steady and familiar. "Didn't expect to see you down here in person." Marlene returned the smile. "Thought I'd handle this one myself. I've learned that when something matters, it's best not to delegate." Terry's brow arched, amused. "That's the truth. What are we processing today?" Marlene slid the folder through the slot in the glass. "Deed transfer into a private trust. All documents notarized and signed." Terry opened the folder and began flipping through the pages with quick, efficient hands. The faint sound of paper against paper filled the silence between them. When she got to the signature page, her eyes flicked up, assessing. "You're removing your son and daughter-in-law from property access," Terry said softly. "Not judgment, just observation." "Yes." Marlene's voice was even. "It's time to make sure everything is where it should be." Terry nodded. "Good for you. Some people wait too long." The printer began whirring, spitting out a confirmation sheet. Terry stamped each page with practiced precision, the sound of the rubber stamp echoing like punctuation marks in the quiet room. "Once this is finalized," Terry said, "they'll be completely removed from any access or rights associated with the property. Utilities, taxes, records, everything routes through the trust." Marlene exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that felt like releasing years of invisible tension. "That's exactly what I want." Terry smiled again, her tone turning just a little warmer. "Then congratulations, Ms. Sharp. As of now, you're officially your own landlord." Valerie nearly burst into laughter when Marlene told her the news later that afternoon. "You're serious?" she said, setting down her whisk mid-stir. "It's done? All official?" Marlene nodded, watching her friend's face light up with mischief. Valerie grinned and turned back toward her mixing bowl. "Then you, my dear, are getting a cake. A proper one." "I think I've had enough sugar for the year," Marlene said, but there was a hint of humor in her tone. "Not this one." Valerie winked. "This one's celebratory. Congratulations, landlord." The word landlord made Marlene chuckle, low and genuine. It wasn't a title she'd ever imagined for herself, but it fit. Not because she'd become something new, but because she had reclaimed what was always hers. By evening, the cake sat on her kitchen counter, frosted in white with neat lettering in Valerie's bold handwriting, "Control restored." The next morning, Marlene sat at her desk as Eli's email came through, a clean, formal notice confirming the trust and lease were fully enacted. Attached was the new rent schedule, typed neatly in his usual efficient style. She printed it, signed it, and filed a copy with the county clerk, officially registering Jason and Emily as tenants under the trust. It was a symbolic act, maybe even petty to some, but to her, it was proof. Paper didn't lie. That afternoon, Jason came by. His knock was sharp, impatient, and his expression when she opened the door was worse. "Mom," he started, already exasperated. "What's going on with this paperwork? Emily and I just got something about rent. Are you out of your mind?" Marlene stepped aside and gestured toward the dining table. "You should sit." "I don't need to sit. I need to understand why you're doing this." "You will," Marlene said calmly. She walked to her desk, retrieved the folder, and laid the trust packet in front of him. The pages slid smoothly under his hand. "Read." Jason skimmed, confusion flickering into disbelief, then into anger. "You transferred everything? You actually— Mom, this isn't fair." "It's legal," she said evenly, "and it's done." Jason pushed the folder back across the table, shaking his head. "You're punishing us." "For what? Because Emily made a comment about dessert?" Marlene's lips curved in a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "No, Jason. I'm protecting what's mine. There's a difference." He didn't respond, just stared at her, jaw tight, before muttering something under his breath and leaving. The door clicked shut behind him, but Marlene didn't move right away. She sat, quiet, letting the silence stretch. Then she opened her laptop and sent Eli a brief message. "Deed confirmed. Tenant notified. Next step, lock accounts." That night, as the house settled into stillness, Marlene's phone buzzed on the counter. A new email alert flashed across the screen, her name on a utility account notification, her brows knit together. She opened the message. Account transfer request denied. Verification mismatch, Emily Sharp. Marlene stared at the words, then let out a slow, almost amused exhale. So Emily had already tried. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She turned off the phone and leaned back in her chair, a low hum of satisfaction in her chest. Let them squirm. Let them scramble. The paperwork was airtight, and Marlene Sharp finally held all the cards. Marlene stood in the kitchen, holding her coffee mug like a talisman. The soft sound of the kettle clicking off in the background barely registered as her mind drifted back to the events of the last few days. The house felt more like hers with every passing moment, the walls no longer echoing with unspoken demands. But she knew that her son and daughter-in-law weren't done yet. The phone buzzed on the counter, dragging her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. Another alert, this time from the gas company. Account transfer request. Emily Sharp. Pending verification. Her lips pressed into a tight line. Of course, Emily was trying to gain control of the utilities, just as she'd tried to claim control over everything else. Marlene's eyes flicked to the stack of paperwork on the table, where everything was neatly documented and locked into place. But it didn't matter. Emily still hadn't grasped the gravity of the situation. Marlene stood and walked over to the counter, picking up her phone. She tapped through the notifications, watching the same request pop up again and again. Electricity, water, gas. All of them filed under her name, with Emily's details slipped in like an afterthought. With a calm that surprised her, Marlene dialed the gas company first. Good morning, this is Marlene Sharp. I'm calling to report some unauthorized account changes. She was careful not to sound too rushed, letting the words land one by one. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, following a script she'd heard 1,000 times. Yes, Ms. Sharp. It appears we've received a request for a name change on the account. We'll need to verify your identity to proceed. Marlene's fingers tightened around the phone. I am the account holder, and I didn't request any changes. Please lock the account immediately and confirm the cancellation of this request. There was a brief silence on the other end. Certainly, Ms. Sharp. I'll take care of that for you right away. You should receive a confirmation within the next 24 hours. Marlene hung up, her pulse steady. One down. She moved through the next 2 companies, each call following the same pattern, methodical, deliberate, and without hesitation. By the time she hung up with the water company, her world felt just a little bit quieter, a little more secure. As she set the phone down, she felt the weight of the last few weeks shift. She had always been in control, but now she felt like she was closing the door on something irretrievable. The doorbell rang. Valerie's voice carried in from the hallway, uninvited but welcome as always. You've been busy. Marlene didn't respond immediately. She stood in the living room, letting the sound of Valerie's footsteps draw closer before she turned. Anything interesting on social media today? Marlene asked, her voice flat but curious. Oh, you bet. Valerie chuckled, stepping into the kitchen with her usual casual confidence. She handed Marlene a phone. You might want to see this. Marlene took the phone, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a post from Emily, a picture of a perfectly staged living room, the caption cryptic and designed for maximum drama. Living with toxic elders, it's a special kind of hell. Foul family, drama. Feeling trapped. Marlene didn't flinch. She had seen this before. Emily's attempts to turn the situation into some kind of martyrdom. That's rich, Valerie muttered, shaking her head as she took a seat at the table. You're the one who's been generous, and she's acting like you're the villain. Marlene scrolled through the comments. Several friends of Emily had weighed in, with sympathetic replies, each one reinforcing the false narrative Emily was weaving. But it didn't matter. That's how they play the game, Marlene said quietly, her fingers tapping against the phone's screen as if the truth would somehow become clearer with each press. They want to make me the enemy, but I'm not playing by their rules anymore. Valerie raised her mug to her lips, a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Control looks different when it's documented. Marlene met Valerie's eyes, the unspoken understanding between them as solid as the paperwork that now defined the future. As if on cue, Jason's name flashed up on Marlene's screen. "I'll take this," Marlene said, her tone still calm, as if nothing had changed. She answered the call, her voice neutral. "Jason." "Mom," he said, the frustration in his voice unmistakable. "What's going on? We can't get the utilities in our name. You're locking everything down. This isn't fair." Marlene leaned against the counter, taking a steadying breath. "It's not unfair. It's necessary." Jason didn't respond for a long moment. She could hear him trying to find the right words, his anger simmering beneath the surface, but nothing came out at first. Finally, he spoke. "Please, Mom, can't we just compromise? This doesn't have to be like this. You're pushing us out." Marlene's hand clenched around the phone. She could feel the pull of old loyalties, the remnants of the person she had been before the walls came down, but she had already made her choice. "I'm not pushing you out, Jason. I'm just putting things where they belong." There was silence on the other end, and Marlene knew he was trying to understand her, trying to make sense of the shift. But it was too late. "Goodbye, Jason," she said softly, her voice firm as she ended the call. She set the phone down on the counter, looking at Valerie, who hadn't said a word throughout the entire conversation. "Do you think they'll ever accept it?" Valerie asked, her voice low, almost gentle. Marlene didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The answer was already clear. "They'll have to," she said. "And until they do, I'll make sure nothing slips through their fingers." Marlene had always found something unsettling about the way her backyard had been treated like an extension of Emily's world, another space she could dominate without asking. But today, Marlene was done being the silent observer. It was just before noon when she noticed the first signs of what was to come. A few cars were already lining the street, and as she stepped into the kitchen, she could hear the distant murmur of voices spilling from the backyard. Marlene's eyes narrowed as she watched through the window. Emily had set up, without a word or permission, a gathering. Again. Marlene had known it was only a matter of time before Emily pushed things too far. She couldn't seem to resist. Without even a glance her way, Emily had claimed the space, just like she'd claimed everything else. Marlene stood still, watching as the backyard transformed into an impromptu venue. Tables were being arranged, drinks set up on the porch. Emily was coordinating, directing guests with her characteristic passive aggressiveness, pretending to be the hostess of it all. A spark of defiance surged through Marlene. She wasn't going to let this one slide, not this time. Her phone was already in her hand before she even realized it. She pressed the camera button, her fingers quick as she snapped picture after picture of the setup, proof, cold and clear. There was no escaping this. Not anymore. The pictures were clinical, the tables, the chairs, the drinks, each frame composed with surgical precision, capturing the violation. This was more than a family gathering. This was another attempt to bend the space to Emily's will. Valerie's footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed by her easy voice. "What's she up to this time?" Marlene didn't answer immediately. She was already clicking through the pictures, confirming each one was as crisp as she needed. When she turned, Valerie was leaning against the doorway, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and understanding. "You're taking pictures?" Valerie asked, her tone almost amused. She doesn't even ask anymore. "No," Marlene said, the word almost tight in her throat. "And she's going to learn the consequences." The camera shutter clicked again as she zoomed in on a few of the guests. Some familiar, some strangers. They were crossing boundaries, standing on the edge of what had once been family territory. It stung. But it was time. Valerie took the phone from her hands before she could take another shot. "No need for too many," she said lightly. "You've got enough, but I'll handle the video." With that, Valerie grabbed her own phone and stepped outside. Marlene knew Valerie was just as good at observing the fine details as she was. Nothing escaped her, not even the smallest violation. She watched through the window as Valerie took careful video, panning over the crowd, capturing the lack of any permit or permission for the event. The chaos. The invasion. Marlene couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction as she watched Valerie's camera flash through the open kitchen door. The boundaries had been drawn in ink, and Emily had crossed them, repeatedly. This time, there would be no tolerance for her behavior. A few minutes later, Valerie returned, the video evidence ready. She handed the phone back to Marlene with a grin. "Ready to put it all in writing?" Marlene didn't answer immediately. She stood by the counter, her fingers hovering over the phone. She could hear Emily's laughter in the background, loud and dismissive. But there was something else now, a silence that came from knowing how this would end. Marlene dialed Eli's number. It was time to make things official. "Eli," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need you to file a formal violation notice against my tenants. They've breached the terms of the lease again, throwing a gathering in the backyard without permission. This time, it's time to act." There was a pause on the other end, but Marlene could almost hear Eli's professional understanding of the situation. "I'll have it processed by the end of the day, Marlene. I'll make sure the notice is sent out immediately." Her fingers tightened around the phone. This was more than just sending a formal notice. This was a line in the sand, an act of taking ownership of what had always been hers. "I'll follow up tomorrow," she added, her voice steady, unwavering. "This can't continue. They need to understand that there are rules." After the call ended, Marlene sat quietly at the table, her gaze lingering on the backyard. Emily and her guests were still laughing, unaware of what was coming for them. But Marlene had learned that things didn't get fixed through kindness. They got fixed through action. As if on cue, Jason's voice echoed from the backyard, raised in frustration as he walked toward the house. She could see his silhouette moving in the window. Jason entered the kitchen, his face tight. "Mom, what's going on? You're overreacting. We've been here so many times. It's just a few people. This isn't worth escalating." Marlene didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him at first. Her focus remained on the stack of legal documents in front of her. Slowly, she met his eyes, her gaze hard but calm. "You're overoccupying, Jason," she said softly. "And this is the result of your refusal to acknowledge the rules." Jason opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. Marlene didn't give him the chance to push back. The weight of everything she had done, the transfers, the calls, the carefully measured steps, settled over her like a cloak. It was done. And now, Emily and Jason would have to face the consequences of their actions. The door to the backyard opened, and a few guests wandered in with drinks in hand. Emily appeared at the threshold, flashing a smile that was equal parts sweetness and disdain. Marlene didn't even flinch as Emily's eyes met hers. "It's all yours, dear," Marlene said coolly, leaning against the counter. "But remember, I'm still the landlord." The finality in her tone echoed louder than any argument Jason could make. Marlene sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt at odds with the chaos outside the walls of her home. The backyard, still buzzing with the remnants of Emily's unauthorized gathering, was no longer her concern. Today, the battle had shifted elsewhere. Her phone buzzed again, the sharp chime cutting through the quiet like a distant drumbeat. She picked it up with a steady hand, already knowing it would be from Jason, or perhaps someone else trying to intervene. But no. This time, it was a text from one of Jason's cousins, Adam. His words were quick, blunt, and tinged with confusion. "What's going on, Marlene? Heard you're making things difficult with Jason and Emily. They're saying you're being cruel to them. Is that true?" Marlene paused, her eyes scanning the message. It wasn't the first time Emily had tried to twist the narrative. She had painted herself as the victim for years, using the family as an audience for her drama. But now, this? Using her son's cousins as pawns? She tapped out a response, measured and calm. "What Jason and Emily are telling you isn't the full picture. I suggest you hear my side before making any judgments. I've always been more than generous, but I'm no longer willing to be manipulated. If you want to know what's really going on, let me know. I'll explain." Marlene set the phone down, knowing that Adam would be curious enough to follow up. Emily's manipulation would only carry so far before the truth came out. It wasn't long before the phone rang. Adam's name flashed on the screen. She answered, her voice smooth, but with an underlying steel she had learned to wield like a weapon. "Marlene?" Adam's voice was hesitant, the tension clear. I I don't know what's going on, but Emily's upset. She says you're trying to push them out of the house, that you're treating them unfairly. I just wanted to check in." Marlene sighed, leaning back in her chair. She could hear the subtle concern in his voice, the confusion. But there was no room for equivocation anymore. She had already made her stance clear with Jason. Now it was time to make sure the rest of the family understood what was really happening. "Adam," she began, her voice low but unwavering, "you've known me for years. You know I've never been cruel or unfair to them, but I've been pushed to a point where I can no longer tolerate their behavior. They've been taking advantage of me for far too long. I've funded Jason's home renovation without repayment. I've let them stay here as if they own the place, and I've tolerated disrespect in my own home for too long." There was silence on the other end, and Marlene knew Adam was processing what she was saying. He had never been particularly close with Emily, but he had always sided with family. That was about to change. She continued, laying it all out with the same clarity she had used to navigate the legal side of things. "The truth is, I've been more than generous. But this behavior, it stops now. Jason and Emily are tenants here, and they're not exempt from the same rules anyone else would have to follow. They've breached the lease terms, and now they have to face the consequences." Another pause. Marlene could almost hear Adam putting the pieces together. His voice finally came through, softer now, a mix of understanding and hesitation. "I didn't realize it had gotten that bad, Marlene. I guess Emily, she's always had a way of twisting things. I didn't know all that." Marlene could feel a sense of vindication building inside her, the power of the truth settling in. They wanted a villain. Now they're just exposed. "That's what they're good at," she said, her voice firm. "But the truth doesn't bend. You know how I've treated Jason and Emily. You've seen it. It's only when you stop enabling them that they turn things around and point fingers. But no one is exempt from the rules anymore." Adam took a long breath before speaking again, more thoughtfully now. "I'll talk to them. I just wanted to hear your side." "Thank you, Adam," Marlene said, her tone warm but final. "Just remember, family doesn't get to rewrite the narrative when they don't like the way things turn out." As she hung up, a quiet calm settled over her. The seeds were planted. Word would spread, and soon Emily's manipulations would no longer hold the same weight. Family was supposed to stand by you, but when they chose sides based on lies, it was time to draw clear boundaries. Marlene's phone buzzed once more, and this time, it was Eli's name on the screen. She didn't hesitate to answer. "Marlene, the deed transfer is complete. All estate access is locked down. Emily and Jason no longer have any control over it. It's all in the trust now. The relief in Marlene's chest was immediate, but tempered with the realization that there would be no turning back. The foundation was set. The house, and her future, was finally in her hands. No one could take it from her. "Thank you, Eli," she said, her voice steady. "It's all coming together now." She ended the call and leaned back in her chair, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. This was just the beginning. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft light over the house as Marlene moved through her morning routine with a practiced calm. She had already made her decision, and now it was time to act on it. The papers, the agreements, the legal work, everything had been set in motion. Today, there would be no turning back. Marlene's hand trembled only slightly as she picked up the 60-day notice from the table. It was official now. It wasn't just a feeling or a threat. It was a document, signed and sealed, that would change everything. She could feel the weight of it in her hand, the weight of a decision years in the making, but she didn't let it show. She walked calmly to the front door, the quiet house enveloping her in its familiar silence. She pasted the notice to the door, the tape pulling away from the paper with a small final snap. For a brief moment, Marlene stepped back, her eyes lingering on the notice. The bold text on the paper was a reminder of the power she now wielded. 60-day notice to vacate. The doorbell rang just as Marlene turned away. A familiar, frantic knock that she'd been expecting. She opened the door slowly. There stood Emily, her face flushed with indignation. The moment she laid eyes on the notice, her whole demeanor shifted. Her jaw dropped, then clenched. She stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What's this?" Emily's voice cracked, the anger seeping into her words. Marlene stood still, her gaze unwavering. "It's the legal notice you've earned." Emily's eyes flicked to the paper, then back at Marlene, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "You're kicking us out? After everything we've done for you?" Her voice rose. "How could you do this to your own son? You—" "No," Marlene interrupted calmly, her tone cutting through the noise like a knife. "You've violated the lease terms. You've overoccupied the space. This is just business, Emily. Nothing personal." But Emily wasn't listening. Her face twisted into something Marlene didn't recognize, something desperate, hurtful. "You're throwing us out? After all the money we put into this place? We've been nothing but good to you. And this is how you repay us?" Marlene stayed silent, her hand steady as she closed the door behind her. She knew this conversation was about control, Emily's desperate attempts to manipulate, to paint herself as the victim. But Marlene wasn't going to play along. Not anymore. From the corner of her eye, she saw Valerie walking into the hallway, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp. Without a word, Valerie reached for the stack of boxes in the corner. Together, they moved toward the storage area. Emily's fury was still echoing from the front yard, but it was no longer her concern. "You've got this all under control?" Valerie asked, her voice light but filled with an unspoken weight. Marlene nodded. "It's time to pack up their things. Let them see the reality of it. They're tenants now. They need to abide by the same rules as anyone else." Valerie grabbed a few boxes, setting them down carefully in the shared storage space. The familiar scent of old books and unspoken family memories filled the air. But Marlene wasn't looking at the old, sentimental objects that had piled up over the years. She was focused on the task at hand, clearing the space, making it her own again. Emily had crossed the line. Now she'd have to face the consequences. Hours passed, and soon enough, Emily and Jason arrived back home. The tension in the air was palpable as Marlene and Valerie worked together, methodically packing up belongings. And then Jason appeared in the doorway, his face pale with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice hoarse with frustration. "You're really doing this?" We're family, Marlene. Please. This doesn't have to go like this. This is our home, too. Marlene didn't flinch, didn't let her guard down for even a second. I've done more than enough for you. I've been generous, but the line has been crossed. This is what happens when boundaries are ignored. Jason stepped forward, his hands wringing nervously at his sides. Mom, you can't destroy the family over a misunderstanding. His voice wavered. Please, we'll compromise. Let's talk about this calmly. It doesn't have to get this ugly. Jason, Marlene said softly, her voice even but carrying a quiet force. You ruined respect. This is just paperwork. The words hung in the air like a finality, a closing chapter. She wasn't going to undo her decision. She had given them every chance. She had allowed them to stay. But now the house, and her life, belonged to her once again. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but Marlene cut him off, her gaze unwavering. This is the end of the conversation, Jason. Jason's shoulders slumped as the weight of his defeat settled in. He was standing there, wanting to believe he could still fix it. But there was nothing left to fix. Not now. The night wore on, and the house fell into a tense, uncomfortable silence. Marlene's phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't a family member calling. It was an email notification from Eli. We've received a complaint. Emily has filed a claim of elder financial abuse against you. It's now in the system. Marlene's fingers tightened around the phone. She read the message again, her pulse quickening just slightly. Emily had gone further than Marlene had anticipated, claiming elder abuse was a new low. She wasn't going to back down now, but she had known something like this might happen. She set the phone down slowly and turned to Valerie, who was sitting beside her. Valerie's face was unreadable, but the flicker of knowing passed between them. They wanted a villain, Valerie said with a hint of dark amusement. Now they're just exposed. Marlene exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the battle ahead, but knowing that, no matter what, this was the beginning of the end. The truth was finally out there, and Marlene Sharp wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. The phone rang, slicing through the quiet of Marlene's house like an unwelcome intruder. Her fingers hovered over the screen, already dreading the name that appeared. It was Eli. Good morning, Marlene. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something she hadn't heard before. Concern, maybe? We've received the claim. The one from Emily. Marlene sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the previous days still pressing on her chest. She had known something like this was coming. Emily had already tried to play the victim, and now she was taking it a step further. Elder financial abuse, Eli continued, his voice smooth but laced with the sharp professionalism she had come to rely on. I'll start pulling the paperwork to defend against this. Marlene's fingers tightened around her mug. It's a lie, Eli. I've been nothing but generous. But they've gone too far. What do we need to do to make sure this doesn't stick? Eli paused, the sound of papers rustling faintly through the phone. We'll need to gather every shred of evidence, bank records, invoices, proof of your mental competency, the works. This won't hold up. But we need to be thorough. Send me the details, Marlene said, her voice steady. I'll get everything together. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Marlene methodically compiled everything, documents, receipts, and texts from years of generous support. She had never wanted this battle, but Emily had forced her hand, pushing her to a place she never thought she'd go. One morning, after hours of sorting through boxes and filing cabinets, Marlene sat back in her chair and took a slow breath. There was one last thing she needed, proof of Emily's own wrongdoing. That's when she remembered the credit card statements. Emily had used her account for personal expenses, without permission. Marlene had never questioned the charges until now, until the magnitude of Emily's audacity became clear. There, buried in the receipts from years past, were the smoking guns. Emily's attempts to leverage Marlene's goodwill for personal gain, spent without her knowledge or consent. Marlene smiled, a cold, controlled expression. It was all there, the evidence she needed to crush the false claim. The social worker arrived at Marlene's house later that week. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a professional air, but Marlene didn't find her intimidating. If anything, she felt an odd sense of reassurance. She wasn't going to be manipulated this time, not by anyone. "Good morning, Mrs. Sharp," the social worker greeted her, her voice soft but businesslike. "I'm here to review the estate and determine your mental competency. It's standard protocol for these kinds of claims." Marlene nodded, feeling the quiet confidence in her chest grow. She had nothing to hide. Not anymore. "I'll make it simple for you," Marlene said, leading the woman into the living room. She handed over the neatly organized files, the bank statements, the proof of Emily's misuse of funds, and the copies of all the legal documentation. The social worker flipped through the pages, her face impassive, but Marlene could see the wheels turning in her mind. After a few long moments, the woman looked up, her expression now one of clear understanding. "I can see everything here. Your mental competency is clearly intact. The charges made by Emily don't hold weight. In fact, I'd say they have nothing to stand on." Marlene's breath caught for a moment before she exhaled slowly. The weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying lifted just slightly. This wasn't over yet, but it was close. The claim was dismissed immediately. Marlene received the notice from Eli just 2 days later. The social worker's report had sealed the deal. Marlene sat in her favorite chair, staring at the dismissal letter. Her fingers gently traced the words as if she couldn't quite believe it. She had won. The system had seen through Emily's lies, and now she was free of the burden. For now. In the next room, Valerie was baking, the smell of freshly made cookies drifting through the house. As she set the last tray in the oven, she popped her head around the corner. "Well, that's one battle won," she said with a grin. "But you're not done yet, are you?" Marlene leaned back in her chair, her fingers gently tapping against the armrest. "No, not yet," she replied, her voice low, almost thoughtful. "But it feels good to have the truth on my side." Valerie raised an eyebrow. "And the cookies? I think you deserve these." She set a plate of warm cookies down on the table. Each one was labeled in icing, unfit to manipulate. Marlene couldn't help but smile, her lips curling into something satisfied, amused. "You always know how to make me laugh." Valerie took a seat across from her, watching her friend carefully. "They wanted a villain, remember? But now they're the ones exposed for what they are." Marlene nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window, where the evening sky was beginning to darken. She felt a flicker of something, like a spark, deep inside her. She had come so close to losing everything, but now it was finally hers again. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise at the front gate. Marlene stood up, walking quietly to the window to peer outside. Through the trees, she saw Jason. He was standing by the gate, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She stood still for a moment, considering him. But then she turned back to the kitchen, where the cookies sat waiting, and a slow, knowing smile crept across her face. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in years, Marlene felt truly in control. Marlene stood at the kitchen window, her eyes watching the driveway, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The familiar sight of Jason's truck pulling up wasn't a surprise, nor was the tension that filled the air as he stepped out. There was a heaviness in his posture, his shoulders sagging as if every step he took towards the house was one of resignation. From the moment the 60-day notice had been posted, the clock had started ticking. And now, the day had arrived. Jason and Emily were finally packing, though neither of them had ever accepted that it was time to leave. They had fought it at every turn, and now they were paying the price. Marlene didn't rush to greet them. She didn't need to. She was done explaining herself. The sound of boxes shifting, the creak of the door, and the low murmur of voices drifted into the kitchen. Emily's sharp tone rose first, followed by Jason's deep, quiet voice. The arguments hadn't stopped. They still didn't understand the gravity of it all. It didn't matter. Marlene had already drawn her line. She picked up her camera, snapping pictures of the moving process. Every step, every box, everything documented just as it had been from the start. The photos weren't for her. They were for the records. Proof of compliance. No room for ambiguity. No room for their manipulations. Jason and Emily worked in silence now, the air thick with bitterness. There was no longer the pretense of normalcy, of family. It was business, and Marlene wasn't about to offer them any comfort. As she captured more photos, the sounds of the moving trucks in the driveway grew louder. Neighbors stood in their yards, watching with quiet curiosity. They'd been waiting for this day, waiting for the moment when the house, the space, would finally be Marlene's again. Marlene didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. A soft knock on the door interrupted the scene. It was Valerie, strolling in casually, as if she hadn't just walked through a front yard filled with the hum of packing and chaos. She gave Marlene a knowing look, her eyes twinkling with a quiet amusement. "Everything going as expected?" Valerie asked, her voice light, but with an edge that Marlene couldn't quite place. "More or less," Marlene said, her eyes flicking toward the front door as Jason and Emily carried out another box, their faces drawn tight with the burden of their own regret. "Not a word from them, huh?" Valerie asked, raising an eyebrow. Marlene shook her head. "They've said plenty already. No point in adding to it." Valerie took a seat at the table, crossing her arms and watching Jason as he carried a box to the truck. "I've always admired your restraint. I don't know if I could be this calm." Marlene smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally been heard after years of silence. "It's not calm, it's just necessary." As Valerie nodded, they both heard the sound of the moving truck's engine starting. The low hum of it seemed to signal the end. It was over. Emily and Jason were gone, but the house, the space that had been taken from Marlene, was finally hers again. At that moment, Emily stormed through the front door, her expression one of pure fury. She didn't bother to look at Marlene, but the air between them crackled with the intensity of her emotions. "You're cruel, you know that." Emily's voice dripped with venom, but it was clear from her posture, her crossed arms, her rigid stance, that the words were empty. They had lost their power. Marlene didn't flinch. She simply raised her camera again, capturing the moment as Emily glared, her words souring with each step she took. Emily didn't speak again, but the resentment burned behind her eyes. She knew that the game was over. Jason entered soon after, his face pale, his shoulders heavy with something unspoken. He stopped in the doorway, but Marlene didn't look up. She didn't need to. Without a word, Jason stepped forward and placed the house keys on the table in front of her. They landed with a small clink, the sound sharp, final. It was the end of an era for him, his own home, his own sense of entitlement, slipping through his fingers. Marlene stood up slowly, her fingers brushing the keys, but not picking them up immediately. Instead, she spoke with a calmness that filled the room with finality. "Thank you, Jason," she said quietly. "I'll take it from here." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it, his face flushing with a mix of frustration and confusion. There was no room left for negotiation. He had been given chances. He had failed to see the truth when it was right in front of him. The door to the house closed with a soft click, the last of their belongings gone, their presence leaving behind nothing but the air of unresolved tension. Marlene turned to Valerie, her smile thin but genuine. They've had their moment. Now it's mine. As the truck pulled away, the house fell into an eerie silence. The weight of years of manipulation, of misused kindness, seemed to fade with each passing minute. But something lingered, something Marlene wasn't sure she had fully accounted for. Valerie stepped out onto the porch, nodding to a passing neighbor who gave a quick wave of acknowledgement. "Be safe out there," Valerie said with a knowing smile. Her eyes flickered to the driveway, where the last remnants of Jason and Emily's things were gone. Marlene stood at the door, her back straight, a quiet resolve settling within her. "I will. And it's just getting started." Later that day, Eli confirmed that the keys had been returned. No damage had been done to the property. Everything was in order. But even as the details settled into place, Marlene knew this wasn't the end. The foundation was set, but there would be more battles ahead. The house, her life, her power. It was hers now. But the fight for her peace was far from over. The morning was crisp, the kind of cool breeze that felt like a promise of new beginnings. Marlene stood at the kitchen window, sipping her coffee, watching as the leaves in the backyard fluttered in the wind. The house, now emptied of Jason and Emily's presence, felt lighter, almost alive again. The air was filled with possibilities, ones that had been stifled for too long. The knock on the door was soft, but Marlene heard it clearly, the weight of the moment setting in. Today was important. Today, she would make a new decision. She opened the door to find a woman standing on the other side. She was tall, with a confident yet reserved air about her. Her name was Claire, and she was from a local domestic abuse shelter. Marlene had been contacted by the shelter a week ago, and today they were meeting to discuss the possibility of renting the space. "Good morning, Mrs. Sharp," Claire said, her smile warm but cautious. "I'm here to take a look at the space. We've had some women from the shelter who are looking for a safe place to stay, and this house could be exactly what they need." Marlene nodded, stepping aside to let Claire in. The house felt different now, the air fresher, as though it was ready to embrace someone new. They walked through the rooms together, Marlene showing Claire each space, and Claire nodding thoughtfully. The two women had been walking through the halls for almost an hour when they reached the backyard. The freshly painted fence, the garden in bloom, and the quiet of the space seemed to make Claire's shoulders relax just a little. "This could work," Claire said, her voice almost tentative as she glanced back toward Marlene. "We'd be able to offer above-market rent because we have a fund set aside for women in need of transitional housing. This space, this home, could give them stability and a fresh start." Marlene paused, taking in Claire's words. It felt right. The house that had been tainted by years of conflict, by betrayal, was now becoming something else. It wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary, a place for healing. "I'll do it," Marlene said quietly. "I'll sign the lease. 6 months. That's all I'll need." Claire's smile deepened, and for the first time Marlene saw something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. By that afternoon, the lease was signed. Marlene sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping lightly against the edges of the papers. The paperwork had been straightforward, but there was something deeper at play here, something that transcended the business side of things. The house would no longer just be a piece of property. It would become a place of new beginnings for someone who truly needed it. As Marlene folded the signed papers neatly and placed them in the file, Valerie came in with a basket in her hands. She had a gleam in her eye, the kind that only came when she was planning something special. "I thought it was time to start welcoming in some new energy," Valerie said, setting the basket down on the table. A garden welcome basket. Fresh flowers, homemade bread, a few cozy touches for their new home. Marlene raised an eyebrow. "You're always prepared, aren't you?" Valerie grinned. "You'll see." They'll love it. The warmth in the room was a contrast to the coolness of the morning, and Marlene felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a quiet kind of joy. She hadn't been sure of her decisions for a long time, but now, she could see a new path ahead, a path she had chosen. Later that afternoon, as Marlene was working on a few more details in the kitchen, her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a familiar name, Emily. Marlene hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. Emily had been quiet for days, her resentment still simmering, but her silence had been telling. And now, the text confirmed it. She replaced family with strangers. Marlene stared at the message for a moment longer than she should have. The bitterness in Emily's words was palpable, but it wasn't enough to disturb the calm Marlene had worked so hard to cultivate. Instead of responding, she put the phone down, the message already fading into the background. Valerie, who had been sitting at the table, noticed the subtle shift in Marlene's expression. "It's from her, isn't it?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Marlene nodded slowly. "Let her say what she wants. She's been doing that for years." She paused, her eyes softening with a quiet understanding. "But I've done what I need to do. And now it's time for someone else to have a chance." Valerie's gaze was approving, her smile warm but knowing. "You're doing it, Marlene. You're turning everything around, one step at a time." Marlene didn't reply. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, where the new tenants would soon arrive, their lives ready to begin again. The house, the space, the future. Everything felt aligned now. She was no longer burdened by the past. She had made her choices, and they were finally her own. The next morning, as Marlene was having coffee in the quiet of the kitchen, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an alert from her bank. She opened it, only to be met with a message about the status of a crowdfunding campaign. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the headline. "Help Marlene Sharp through her decline. Support her journey." A GoFundMe page, created by none other than Jason and Emily. Her fingers froze over the phone. The audacity of it, the manipulation, the complete disregard for everything Marlene had done for them. But as the initial wave of anger passed, Marlene set the phone down slowly, her breath evening out. Emily and Jason had made their move, but Marlene had already won. She wasn't the victim in their narrative. She never had been. And now, she was free to write her own story. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the kitchen. Marlene sat at the table, the papers in front of her feeling heavier than they should. Each document was a symbol of finality, of decisions made after years of quiet endurance. The house, her sanctuary, now reflected the changes she had initiated. The walls held memories of conflict, but they were becoming the backdrop of something new. Marlene's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table as she gazed at the papers. Today, she was doing something different. Something George would have been proud of. After years of working in their bakery together, Marlene and George had never really discussed what would happen after they were gone. It had always been a quiet understanding between them, no need to formalize it. But now, with everything shifting, Marlene realized she wanted to ensure something lasting, something meaningful. She wanted to honor him, to give back in the way they had always dreamed. She reached for the papers, a stack of documents detailing the creation of a culinary grant in George's name. She had taken her time, researched, and chosen an organization that would keep his legacy alive. This grant would support aspiring chefs, giving them the same opportunity George had had when he started. It wasn't just a donation, it was a part of her, a continuation of what they had built. With a steady hand, Marlene signed the final document. She paused before setting the pen down, her thoughts drifting to the years George had spent by her side. She missed him, of course, but this grant, this act of giving, was as close as she could come to bringing him back. She smiled softly, knowing that this was a step in the right direction. The next few hours passed quickly, with Marlene tending to the details of her estate. She had already decided who would be responsible for her future. It was time to name an executor, someone she could trust implicitly, someone who had stood by her through it all. Valerie. Marlene reached for the legal documents and carefully filled in the name. Valerie had been a lifeline, a constant in her life when everything had seemed uncertain. There was no one else she would trust more to carry out her wishes. She paused, staring at the signature line for a moment. It felt right, signing Valerie's name there. It wasn't just about the estate. It was about loyalty. It was about trust. But then her fingers hesitated again as they hovered over the next section of the documents. Removal of Jason and Emily from all inheritance rights. It was the final step, the last thing she had to do to fully reclaim control. She thought about the years of manipulation, the entitlement they'd shown, and how they had twisted her generosity into something to be taken for granted. Marlene signed her name with determination, knowing this decision would close the door forever. She wouldn't let them tear apart everything she'd worked for. Later that afternoon, Marlene sat on the porch, watching as the new tenants painted the back fence. It was a simple task, something that hadn't been tended to for years. But it felt different now. The house was becoming what she had always wanted it to be, a space for fresh starts. The young couple worked with quiet determination, laughing softly as they passed the paint roller between them. Marlene had always wanted to take care of the house, but now, for the first time, she felt the joy of watching someone else care for it. Valerie appeared at her side, a knowing smile on her lips. "You're making a difference here, Marlene. This house will have new memories now, won't it?" Marlene nodded slowly. "It already has?" she said softly. As they sat there, watching the tenants work, Valerie suddenly reached into her bag and pulled out a framed quote. She set it down on the table in front of Marlene, a small smile on her face. "Age is not irrelevance." Marlene's eyes lingered on the words, feeling the quiet power behind them. Valerie knew her better than anyone else, knew how the years had worn her down, how the struggles had made her question her worth. But now, as the house came alive with new purpose, the words felt like a reminder. Her age, her experiences, everything she had been through, it had all led her to this moment. And it mattered. "I think it's time," Valerie said, her voice low but filled with meaning. "You've earned this, Marlene." Marlene picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the edges of the glass. "It's a new chapter, isn't it?" Valerie nodded. "One you get to write for yourself?" The next morning, Marlene went to the courthouse alone. She didn't need anyone with her. This was her final step, making sure everything was officially in place, that her will and estate were set up exactly as she wanted. The courthouse was quiet when she arrived, the floors cool beneath her feet. She moved through the halls with purpose, steady in her resolve. The clerk at the counter greeted her warmly, but Marlene's focus never wavered. The paperwork was processed quickly, and as the clerk handed her the final documents, Marlene felt a calm satisfaction settle over her. She had taken control. She had protected her legacy, her home, her future. But just as she was about to leave, her phone buzzed again. It was an email from Eli. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the subject line. "GoFundMe alert, your decline." Her breath caught in her chest as she opened the message. Emily and Jason had done it. They had started a campaign, claiming she was in financial decline. Marlene's fingers clenched around the phone. They hadn't given up. They were still trying to control her narrative, even from a distance. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but then she set the phone down slowly. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a response. They had already lost. She had already won. Marlene sat in her living room, the glow from her desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. The weight of the evening seemed to press down on her shoulders, heavier than it had any right to be. Her fingers still held the phone, though she hadn't moved in what felt like an hour. The GoFundMe campaign that Emily and Jason had started was open in front of her on the screen, the headline stark and unflinching: "Help Marlene Sharp through her decline." She stared at it for a long moment, the audacity of their actions seeping into her bones. How dare they? How could they twist the truth, paint her as the victim in a narrative they had fabricated so skillfully? Her fingers trembled slightly, but there was no hesitation in her next move. She tapped on the link to report the fraudulent fundraiser. The words she typed were brief but precise, each one coming out of her with a cool detachment she hadn't known she still possessed. "This campaign is fraudulent. Marlene Sharp has not requested any assistance. The claim made in this fundraiser is false, and the organizers are attempting to exploit her reputation for personal gain." She hit send, and a strange sense of satisfaction washed over her. She wasn't going to let them get away with this, not after everything they had already taken. It took less than 12 hours for the notification to appear. She had been lying in bed, the soft sound of the wind brushing against the windows, when her phone buzzed. The notification from the crowdfunding platform was simple but final: "Campaign suspended due to fraudulent claims." A sigh of relief escaped her lips. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a significant blow to their narrative. Emily and Jason had tried to manipulate the world, to gather sympathy and funds off her name. But Marlene had stopped them. She would stop them every time. The next day, the letter she had been working on all night was ready. It was a letter to the editor, a public statement to clear her name. It had to be done. She sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and began to write with a clarity that came from years of silence, from years of allowing others to control the narrative of her life. "I am not in decline," she wrote, the words flowing steadily from her pen. "I am a woman in control. I am a woman who has been generous, but I will not be made to feel guilty for demanding respect. I have spent my life building something real, and I will not let anyone take that from me. Not now, not ever." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that would reach far beyond her own small circle. She didn't need to defend herself against Emily's lies. She only needed to make the truth clear. After a few moments of reflection, Marlene added the final lines to the letter. "I will continue to honor the legacy I have built, not as a woman in decline, but as someone who has learned, grown, and fought for everything she holds dear. To those who choose to exploit my name, you will be exposed for what you are." She folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and addressed it to the editor of the local paper. Marlene wasn't done. This was her story to tell, and she wasn't going to let anyone distort it any longer. By the time Marlene returned from delivering the letter, her phone was buzzing again. This time, it wasn't a notification from a crowdfunding site. It was something much more immediate. A news outlet had already picked up the story. They were calling her letter to the editor a defiant response to exploitation, and their coverage was spreading rapidly. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched the news outlet's social media page explode with comments. The story was shared, reshared, and shared again. The public response was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. The words, "I am not in decline," became a rallying cry. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about reclaiming power. Donations started pouring in, but not for the GoFundMe campaign Emily and Jason had set up. No, the money was coming in for the culinary grant Marlene had established in George's name. People from all over the country were sending funds, inspired by the truth of her story. In less than a day, Marlene's culinary grant had exceeded its initial goal, with contributions from chefs, restaurateurs, and ordinary people who saw her for who she really was, a woman who had worked her entire life to create something meaningful. They were standing with her. They were honoring George's memory. By the time evening fell, the email from the GoFundMe platform had arrived. They had not only suspended the fundraiser, but also informed Emily and Jason that their actions had violated platform guidelines. Marlene's heart swelled with a quiet triumph. They had been exposed for what they were, opportunists. And the world knew it. Marlene sat quietly in her chair, the house still and peaceful around her. She glanced out the window, the soft glow of the streetlights spilling onto the lawn. She had won this battle. It was clear now. But there was something more that she couldn't quite place, something beyond the legal victory, beyond the donations. It was the finality of the moment. For the first time, Marlene felt the weight of her own strength, her own voice. And the best part? She wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed once more, this time with a message from Valerie. "You didn't just defend yourself. You created something real. Proud of you, Marlene." Marlene smiled softly, knowing that this was only the beginning. Emily and Jason had tried to manipulate the world, but Marlene had written her own story, and it was far from over. The garden was alive with color, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the sweet scent of freshly bloomed flowers, and the gentle hum of voices made Marlene's backyard feel like the sanctuary it was meant to be. She stood at the edge of the patio, surveying the scene. The table was set with careful precision, bright white tablecloths, crystal clear glasses of lemonade, and flowers arranged in low vases, their petals catching the sunlight just right. It was a garden brunch, but it was something more. For Marlene, it was the first time in a long while that she had felt like she could finally breathe without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her. This was her space, her decision, and for the first time in years, everything felt right. She stood by the door, watching as Valerie helped a couple of her new tenants carry out platters of food to the table. The young couple had settled in a few weeks ago, and already Marlene felt a sense of peace, knowing they were the ones making this house feel like a home again. One of the tenants, a woman named Sarah, approached her with a warm smile. "The food looks amazing, Mrs. Sharp," she said softly. "You've really outdone yourself." Marlene smiled, a genuine warmth flooding through her. "It's all thanks to Valerie," she said, casting a glance at her old friend, who was arranging the chairs with a kind of unspoken grace. Valerie had been the one to insist on this brunch, a way for Marlene to truly mark her new beginning. As the tenants settled at the table, their soft laughter mixing with the clink of silverware, Marlene turned toward the kitchen. The lemon bars she had baked that morning were arranged neatly on a platter. The citrus scent filled the air as she carried them outside, setting them at the center of the table, where the lights seemed to highlight their golden edges perfectly. "I think these will be a hit," Marlene said, her voice light but full of quiet pride. It had been a long time since she had cooked for others, since the days when George had been beside her in the kitchen. But now it was her joy once again, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The guests took their seats, and the table buzzed with conversation. There were no awkward silences, no unresolved tensions, just the kind of peaceful atmosphere Marlene had been longing for, a place where she didn't have to justify her every move. As they ate, the words from the past few months began to fade into the background. This was where Marlene belonged. As she walked over to refill a glass of lemonade, Marlene heard the familiar hum of an approaching car. She glanced up, surprised to see Eli's vehicle pulling into the driveway. He stepped out of the car with a smile, a manila folder tucked under his arm. Marlene's eyes met his as he approached the table, and for a moment, she could see the same quiet respect in his eyes that she had felt throughout their professional relationship. "I figured today was a good time to make things official," Eli said, sitting down beside Marlene as he placed the folder in front of her. The soft chatter of the table seemed to fade away as she opened the folder. The trust, the deed, the will. Everything was in order. She had made sure of it. It was all finally hers. The weight of the finality settled in her chest, a quiet relief washing over her as she glanced down at the neatly signed documents. Marlene smiled to herself, running her fingers over the papers. "Everything's where it should be," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything she had endured. She hadn't just regained control of her home, she had taken control of her future. Valerie, who had been watching the exchange with a knowing look, raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice warm, but with an edge that made everyone laugh. "To new beginnings," Marlene echoed, raising her glass with a slow, steady motion. Her gaze flickered toward the garden, the space that had once felt so heavy now transformed into something bright, full of potential. As they drank and ate, the air shifted. The past few months, the tension, the fights, the manipulations, seemed like a distant memory. For the first time in ages, Marlene felt like she was living on her own terms. It wasn't long before one of the neighbors wandered over. A woman who lived 2 doors down. Someone Marlene had known for years. She looked at the gathering with a curious smile before leaning in a bit closer. "Didn't your daughter-in-law used to host these kinds of things here?" the neighbor asked, her voice filled with light curiosity. Marlene looked at her, her smile slipping just a fraction. For a moment, she felt the sharp sting of Emily's absence, the legacy of their years together suddenly cutting through the calm of the moment. But she didn't let the feeling linger. Instead, she tilted her head, the same cool confidence she'd worn over the last few months returning. "She had her moment," Marlene said, her voice steady, her smile returning. The words were final, a quiet acknowledgement that she had been the one to make this choice. Her choice, not theirs. She took a slow breath and returned her gaze to the garden, watching the guests continue to laugh and talk. It was her moment now, and it felt exactly the way it was supposed to. Later in the afternoon, after the guests had left and the evening settled in, Marlene stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. The house felt peaceful, the kind of peace she hadn't known in years. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up, her fingers automatically opening the message. It was from Emily. "You think this is it, don't you? Replacing family with strangers. Let me know how it feels when they turn on you. You won't win in the end." Marlene stared at the screen, her breath even. There was a time, not so long ago, when these messages would have shaken her. But not now. Now they didn't even sting. Marlene placed the phone down gently. She didn't need to respond. The house was hers, her legacy intact. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the warmth of something solid beneath her feet. As the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, Marlene smiled softly. She had already won. "She skipped my dessert, so I served her the deed,"